Hey everyone, welcome to the Sacramental Charismatic. My name is Wes. I'm joined here by Luke Geraty. Welcome, Luke.
Good to see you.
What's happening?
Again. Not much. Just hanging out. Just enjoying this wonderful, fruitful dialogue that I have with you.
Luke is all the way in Red Bluff, California. You guys, it's pretty much summer there now, right?
No, we're gonna get some rain soon. It's still winter. It's 55. It's rough.
Oh man, I'm sorry. Jeez, that's
yeah.
hard.
And Wes, you are in Vancouver, Washington, aka Portland.
Pretty much, Portland's like we're just the quieter side of Portland. We're like a suburb of Portland.
Yeah.
So
you're right across the river, correct?
Right across the river, yeah. Not in Canada. In Canada. I am shocked at how many Americans don't know that. So
they don't know that Vancouver.
There's another
Washington.
Vancouver. Yeah, there's a Vancouver in America.
No one cares, to be honest.
No one cares. Yeah. No.
Yeah. So what are we going to talk about today?
Today we are talking about evangelism, a big topic, and we might go into two depending how much we get through today. But it's really important because if you want to grow, you have to evangelize as a church.
Yeah.
So it's a hot topic, and I would say even more so now. I think there's a lot of Christians my age and younger who are Christians that probably have a very different idea about evangelism than maybe was the case 20 years ago. Or even 30 years ago. We're both part of the Vineyard tradition where power evangelism was the main way to evangelize. And I would suggest that a lot of people are unsure about that way. So I think it's a good topic to talk about and see, what evangelism looks like today. Yeah.
That's good. Well, we should probably start by defining your term, evangelism.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Great. Sweet. Well, I mean, I think evangelism historically is rooted in the proclamation, and in our circles, proclamation and demonstration of the message of the King and Kingdom. So coming from the Greek word euangelizo, evangelizing. So it has to do with like heralding the good news, right?
Yeah.
Preaching the good news, sharing the good news, speaking the good news, doing acts of kindness with the intention of helping people experience the love of God. I don't know. I got nothing else.
No, that's good. That's good. You brought in Greek, and so that automatically makes you sound authoritative on the issue. That's all you need to do.
Yeah,
so,
we just don't know if we pronounced it right because no one knows.
No one knows. It's fine. Yeah. No, that's good.
I will say, though, I do not like the idea of evangelism being divorced from discipleship.
Okay, tell me more.
I'm going to throw that out there.
Okay.
Well, I think if we had to pick a primary text from Scripture that people would lean on, that seems to solidify the necessity and importance of evangelism. It's Matthew 28, the Great Commission, where Jesus says, "Go and make disciples," and it doesn't say go and just tell people things. And it's rooted, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey all of my commands. So I think that, it's important to always have like a pretty coherent, integrated approach to this subject where evangelism and discipleship are not divorced from each other. It's not like we go do evangelism and then later on we can do discipleship. I think that's an unhelpful way of doing it.
And I'm just thinking when you're talking about, there's so many biblical texts and stories that show that, I'm thinking specifically of the woman at the well, like she encounters Jesus, and Jesus doesn't go, okay, now you need to enter into a 12-week discipleship course.
Yeah.
Before you can evangelize.
Mm.
he immediately said, "Go and tell others."
Yeah.
And
And
so
then
I,
and she
yeah,
does. I mean, the story, she goes back to her village and tells everybody, come and meet this person.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's and often, it goes so often that people who come to know Jesus for the first time are normally the people who immediately do go out and tell others about what they've experienced and who they've
Yeah.
encountered and all of that. So I think that's good because a lot of times, at least in a lot of discipleship stuff that I've encountered, evangelism seems to be like tacked on, or
Mhm.
like it's sort of like, okay, we'll get there. And I can understand why there might have been like zero discipleship happening in the church. And so you go, okay, this, but it seems to be a split. So I really like the way that you've said, no, this is part of discipleship.
Yeah.
Um,
I think it's unfortunate that we have broken apart what I think Jesus intended and the apostles intended to be, combined together. But I mean, I think it does feel like, I don't know if you've noticed this, but it seems like one of the primary challenges to the church these days, that are influenced maybe by more Western philosophical, cultural stuff, is the necessity of, what we would used to call conversion, or,
mm,
the necessity of Christ, I guess would be the other way, or the
yeah.
exclusivity of Jesus. It feels like oftentimes that's one of the things that, a lot of younger, I don't know if it's just younger folks, but it seems like a lot of younger folks are hesitant to, to land on that place, where we would say that, salvation is, Jesus is necessary for salvation, and there has to
Hmm.
be some sense of faith or belief, that's rooted in Christ's life, death, resurrection.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think that there probably is a different way of looking at it, perhaps, amongst younger folks. But also, I think too, probably a lot of that comes from some of the really dysfunctional and unhealthy, evangelism practices from the past, where it was, like people just were trying to check a box, and get,
Hmm.
like, I know one person in particular who's a part of a uh, church movement, that's kind of more on the extreme hyper Pentecostal side of things. And I mean, they literally they're all about just getting, like, they don't care if you respond.
Mm,
They don't care about that.
mm,
They're just like, we just need to get the message. And after that, we're no longer responsible for what you
yeah.
do with it, And so it's a very like calloused approach to evangelism, I think, a lot of the time, where it's not rooted on relationship at all, because they don't
Mm,
care about that. Like that's,
yeah.
like that's not a point. So I think it just feels like some of the unbalances. Well, it's like the church is always swinging from one pendulum to the next, and has for a long time.
Mm,
So, but I'm definitely concerned about that. Like, I want
yeah.
people not to suffer whatever consequence is ahead of them, which I
Oh,
know.
you're not a universalist yet?
Oh, I'm not. I'm the opposite of a universalist.
Okay.
Um, I'm a everybody's universally going to hell.
Oh,
Can
so
I
you're
say
on the
that?
other side.
I'm a
Nice.
Calvinist.
Nice.
Yeah,
That's
total
awesome.
depravity. No, but I
Yeah.
mean, on a serious note, whether you hold to eternal conscious torment, the traditional approach to hell, or if you're an annihilationist, um, both of those positions see there being, a consequence for rejecting Christ and not, receiving Christ or turning to Christ,
Mm,
however you want to put it. And I think that those are biblical concepts, biblical things, and so I think, I'm not a universalist. I just am not convinced by any of the readings of any of the two texts that they tend to appeal to.
gotcha.
Sorry, that was mean. That was
Oh, man.
dismissive, but good. Now you know where I'm standing.
I think we should do a podcast on this.
Yeah,
Um,
it'll be 5 minutes long. That's dumb. Don't do that. So,
No, but I think you bring up a big, good point, because just in my own story, I remember being in a youth group where there was a huge emphasis on us inviting our friends to youth group, right?
mm-hmm.
It was like, that was the main thing. Like, we want to create as many events as possible where you can invite as many of your friends as impossible. They come, they experience God, they experience power, and then like that's the thing. And so we would constantly do this. But I did find that, I felt like I missed out on like maybe the depth of Jesus, or different aspects to Jesus. And so when I come, and then I remember, like, for me, my personal one, I know a lot of other people share this, is like they come across someone like Dallas Willard and they go, oh my gosh, like this is the first time I'm reading about this richness and this depth and this beauty, this other side to Christianity, where Jesus is so much more than what we've been told about, and the Christian life is so much richer than we've been told about. But then inevitably, like, there seems to be a culture, and I know we've threatened to talk about Dallas Willard for a while, but there does tend to there does tend to be this then reversal of like, okay, well, we're never evangelizing then. And I know Dallas would never, like, I know Dallas Willard, is not promoting that, but there just seems to be this thing, okay, we're going completely inward.
Yeah, it seems like we could do a podcast on Dallas Willard and then Dallas Willard's followers.
Exactly. Yeah, we'll break it up.
Yeah.
But I know that's something that I personally struggle with, and especially in contemporary culture where the church is just constantly getting a bad rap. Every single week, something else is coming up. And it's like, there's often times where it's like you feel more shame about being a Christian than you do like liberated or freed, or, there's like, I don't want to tell anyone about this because I'm embarrassed, or, and so it's a really tough reality that we're navigating right now. And so I think I'm really glad that we're talking about this, because it's important still.
It seems like, you and I both, there's so many church leader failures that have happened. You and I are aware of one going on right now that's pretty intense. And it's one of, there's nobody who's flying under the radar in that regard. It seems like, every tradition,
nobody's safe.
Every church. And just the last couple of days I've been thinking about, I'm like, I don't know if I want to use the term church anymore. It's work, or pastor. It's like, I'm a pastor, but not that kind.
Not that, You're just constantly qualifying your identity.
Yeah. And so I think I do get that. But what's interesting is I was talking to someone probably about maybe a month and a half ago. I was getting coffee with somebody, and they were talking about, so they had experienced a lot of really bad church stuff, like they had a long list of moral failures and church failures, but when they were sharing how they came to faith, what it was is they remembered they were in a pretty bad place in life, and just feeling really like alone and broken, and they had this memory of one of their foster parents. When they were going in and out of foster care, they had one foster parent that was serious about following Jesus and was kind to them and loved them. And that experience with a true, authentic follower of Jesus, overcompensated and I wouldn't say wiped out the bad stuff, but it definitely caused them to realize that, it was almost in a sense that they knew those other people weren't real. They weren't real Christians, and I was like, I kind of walked away from that conversation thinking about how if we can follow Jesus really well and be faithful, there's a lot of transformative power in that, it's able to almost supersede and overcome some of these terrible things that we, read and hear and, see happening on the internet. So it's not an excuse for those things. I think we need to address them, and the church needs to constantly be internalizing and reflecting but it was
Mm.
also really encouraging. Like, okay, like there is something to being a
There's
faithful
still
follower of
hope.
Jesus. Yeah, yeah, there still is hope.
There's hope. Yeah, I think as much as we talk about like how the West is individualized, but that is speaking to the power of your individual walk with Christ is
Yeah.
important. And
Well, yeah. Think
yeah.
about, I mean, going back to Woman at the Well, John 4,
Mm,
like that was an individual
yeah.
woman who went back and impacted her whole entire community,
Yeah.
and
Through her
so,
individual personal experience with
yeah, it's
Jesus.
like, I think Americans are constantly reminded, and not just Americans, I think Western society people are constantly reminded about how, we live in such an individualistic
Hmm.
society. And that's, true. And it's definitely a cultural challenge we have to see the Bible pushes back against. But on the other hand, in the communal setting of the first century, it was still important for individuals to
Hmm.
engage in missional work. So yeah,
Yeah.
once again, it's both and.
Yes, both end. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
both and. Such a great word.
What you when you were talking, it made me realize that we often talk about like wanting to lead a missional life as if it's something you're not doing and then you start doing, but your life is always missional whether you realize it or not.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to understand. It's like, oh, I'm not going to start being missional. I already am being missional.
Mm,
How am I being missional is a better
yeah.
question. Or,
Yeah. I think, really coming to the point where we're supposed to be missional followers of Jesus, right?
mhm.
Where we're engaged in, yeah. So, like, what are we doing to be, I think it's about intentionality. I mean, I think most things when it comes to evangelism or sharing our faith and discipleship is it just has to do with it, with being intentional with
Mm,
how we're living, how we're leading, how we're serving, how we're speaking, how we're relating to people. Because I was thinking about how, like maybe if we could talk a little bit about practical ways for
yeah.
individuals to share their faith. One thing I feel like I was blessed, in the it probably would have been the late '90s now, in the early 2000s. Willow Creek, had a lot of influence back then, and we didn't know all the naughty, bad, terrible,
Hmm.
tragic stories, but there was I think it was Mark Middleburg, was his name, and he wrote a book on becoming a contagious Christian and being a contagious church. And I think I went to a workshop or something like that, and I heard someone kind of talking about some of the ideas he had in his book, which it's been a long time since I read his book. But what I walked away from that workshop um, realizing was that there's a lot of different types or ways to evangelize.
Mm,
And, like, because I think so let's use power evangelism in our charismatic circles. It was this idea of sharing the message of Jesus, but that message oftentimes was connected to praying for someone to be healed or
mm. Or
some type.
getting a word or an image from the Holy
Yeah.
Spirit or something. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I can tell you, I have lots of stories that I could share about. I mean, I was with this one dude one time, and we were literally walking home from like a coffee shop, like open mic thing,
Mm,
and this friend I had was like pretty charismatic, Pentecostally, hear from the Holy Spirit, kind of guy, and a little weird, but we were walking one time, and we like came up to a bar or a tavern, or type of thing. And he's like, "Hey, I need to go in there really quick." And I was like, "Oh yeah." And he's like, "Yeah, there's somebody in there. I just feel like the Lord just gave me a word for someone in there." And I'm like, "Okay." And we walked in, and he walked right up to somebody at the bar, and he like gave him a prophetic word. Some people would call it a word of knowledge. And so he gave this prophecy about this person's family member, and this guy knew all these details about him. And the guy was just like, how do what? And then he
mm,
also like prayed for this guy's ankle, and he was healed.
Mm.
And it happened all like within, I don't know, it was probably 10 minutes of talking, and he,
Mm.
the whole 9 yards. And the dude gave his life to Jesus, started going to the church we were going to, and it was like, that's power evangelism,
Mm.
right? But then I will say I live in an area, and there's a church up in Reading. No names, no names,
No.
but
Yeah.
I've been up there before where I have these students come up to me to like do power evangelism, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just like the worst thing ever. It's like, I mean,
Wait, can I ask you, like, why is it the worst thing? Like, what
well,
would you say is like not
there's
great about
no like they're not. So my impression, they're not there to listen. They're
it?
there to
Mm.
speak. Because I think in that theological tradition, oftentimes you have people who buy into a subtle form of prosperity, word of faith type stuff, where it's
Mm.
like there's power in my words, and so
Mm.
you just need to listen to my words because I'm
Mm.
prophesying something that is going to come to pass type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because the times it's happened, I'm like, I try to be respectful and kind and listen, but after a while, I'm like, yeah, so I'm already a Christian, and they're
Yeah.
like, no, you're not, and I'm like, no, I am,
Yeah.
and then I'll even sometimes be like, well, actually, I pastor a church, and then they're like, oh, and it's like super weird. But the way they go about doing it, I think is. And that I think that can be true of any power evangelism. Like I'm pro power
Mm.
evangelism, but I also feel like what I learned going back to that workshop is what I remember learning was that there's a lot of different methods and models or tools to the evangelistic enterprise.
Mm.
Meaning, so some person might like that experience I had in that bar with that guy, like that would work for some people. But
Mm.
for some people, that's going to be like, dude, that's so weird. Get out of here. Or, or
Mm.
maybe what happens if you don't get a prophetic word for somebody? But what will work for them is to become friends and just share, meals together over the course of a year or two. And,
Mm.
or, like my wife, Dawn has been talking to this one person that she knows for like 2 years now, and just sharing a little bit here, sharing a little bit there, and has invited this person to church several times, and like they finally are like, hey, I'd like to come and check it out. And they're now, but it's been a long time of relational
Mm.
friendship evangelism.
Mm.
Okay. um so I think when it comes to some of the practical ways for individuals to evangelize, I think that it comes back to like get as many tools as you can,
Mm.
you know um meaning I think we need to learn how to pray for people. I think we need to learn how to listen to people,
Mm.
and actually be good listeners, not just telling them, the gospel. Listening for needs, listening for opportunities. We should serve. I think, doing acts of kindness, random acts of kindness can be really powerful, and sometimes big acts of kindness. I mean, I know people who have like been in grocery stores that purchased the groceries for somebody,
Mm-hmm.
behind them or in front of them, and it
Mm.
was a pretty big deal. Um, and then I think there are some people who having intellectually engaging, stimulating answers to life's big questions is also part of that. I mean,
Yeah.
that's I think important too. So,
It's a huge need. Yeah, I remember down in Houston, I had a friend. He was in seminary with me, and he started this uh, uh, book club on going through Jürgen Moltmann stuff. But there
that's awesome.
was it was all non-believers that were
Oh,
there,
really?
and I
Yeah.
was like, what the heck? And they were all like digging through this, and I was like, wow, this is incredible. I don't know if any of them like became
Yeah.
believers or anything, but
That's
there's
amazing.
definitely, I think,
That's hilarious.
yeah, like who would have thought?
Yeah. The malt comes through once
A
again.
malt.
Good old
Every
Moltmann.
time you hear like someone's like, I often hear like people like, oh, Jürgen Moltmann was the most overrated theologian, and I'm like, okay.
I know.
Anyways,
That's when you just say, I dismiss everything you say and believe.
anyways,
Yeah.
yeah.
Exactly.
But I think what you bring up is a really good point too. And like going back to like the individualized way, I think one beautiful thing about that is you can evangelize to a way that's authentic to who you are as a person too, and your
Mm,
context. I can think of like ways in which
mm,
there's some people that are their personality is just way more. A-type driven, and they hear the Spirit in a certain way, and they go up to people like in the middle of nowhere. But it's authentic and it checks out too. And it's not like they're giving constantly like forced stuff. It comes naturally to them. And I think that's the beautiful thing about power evangelism is like John Wimber broke through, and that whole crowd broke through a lot of barriers in that way, because like for John, I think his personality was just like, he was like, why aren't we doing this? We should do this. And then he just did it. You know, not everyone can just go like that, but there might be ways in which someone hears from the Spirit in a different way, and through a book club, you know, or whatever it is. I think that's sometimes churches can fixate on one way to evangelize and say this is the only way, whereas actually there's so many different ways, like you just listed, that can be authentic to you as a person.
And I think also too, we probably need to just, you know, when we're thinking about practical ways to share our faith, you know, so practical is an interesting word, right? Because it kind of leans into the charismatic side of having pragmatic approaches to things, like what's going to work, what's effective. You know, so I think that in today's world, it seems like what's most effective right now definitely has to do with relationship, friendship. I think serving, you know, being intentional with how you serve as part of that. But I wonder if like, it just seems like, you know, prayer, the connection, you know, so again, you know, evangelism and discipleship being intertwined, you know, man, praying for people, like actually praying for people on a regular basis that they would come to know Jesus, you know, fits into that. You know, Paul talks about this idea of watering, you know, or sowing. Not everybody gets to harvest, right? So it's like some people plant seeds, some people water, other people harvest. And so, you know, I think it's like the more that we can become, gosh, it's like an intersection of so many things, because I'm thinking about why is it that you and I have had, like, our concern about the Dallas Willard followers is a lot of them, you know, are so fundamentally focused on the inner life to the point where they exclude the outward expressions in some ways, you know, or the outward missional engagement side of things. And it's like, I think Dallas Willard, and he has said, no, like the inner life is supposed to fuel the outward, you know, expressions, so to speak. So, you know, like you look at the intersection of all these different aspects of our own discipleship. You know, it's like we're going to be better listeners, we're going to be better followers, we're going to be better at sharing and serving, and all of that stuff fits into the economy of God's work. You know, in the world that we live in. And I think too, you know, I don't know, what do you think about this? This is very Moltmannian. Is there's not a human being alive that the Holy Spirit is not currently at work in. You know, if we really believe that, because I remember when I first like started reading Moltmann and I started discovering his pneumatology a bit, I was like, that was one of the most freeing things for me, because up until that point, I kind of felt like all evangelism was like, it rested on me. Like, I have got to know, and this is a really common thing that people say, is like, well, I have to know all the answers to all the possible questions that someone might ask me. And until I know the answer for all those, I'm just not going to share my faith, because what if they ask me, how can a loving God, you know, allow evil things to happen, or suffering or whatever? But when I came to the conclusion after, and really Moltmann's just talking about texts of scripture and, you know, kind of the overall thrust of the New Testament. But when I started thinking about how there's no human being that A, God doesn't love, and then B, that God's not at work in some way, shape, or form around that person, in other people around that person, like that was so freeing for me, because then it was like, okay, I can be my authentic self and I play the part that I play. And I might not be the person who gets to like pray the sinner's prayer with somebody, but I might be the person whose my life example or a conversation helps stimulate their movement towards Jesus, you know, like directionally. So that was really freeing for me.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about how there's so many, you know, I mean, ultimately what we're talking about is like how are we loving people in, this is evangelism is a way of how we are loving people. And so I have a lot of thoughts on my mind. One is like the accidental ways in which we evangelize without
Mm.
consciously knowing it. Like,
Oh.
and that's just because we're positioning our lives, focusing on the kingdom of God and Jesus, right? Like we're orientating on our naturally, there's things that are going to happen where people might go, oh, that's speaking to me. Like I remember when I was in Red Bluff and I was on some council board that I got invited. I don't know what it was. Anyways, it had something to do with some council in Red Bluff, and there was another pastor there. You probably know him. He's an older guy, and he came
Mhm.
in and he spoke about like such practical stuff that the city could do to help the homeless. And he got really angry at one point because he felt like the city wasn't doing enough.
Mm.
But like I was going, oh my gosh, if I wasn't a Christian, I was a Christian and I was going, oh man, I want to know, this guy has got something that's
Is that when
fueling
you
this
left our
anger.
church to go to his church?
Yeah, yeah.
That guy's doing
Um,
cool.
but I just thought like if someone saw how passionate they were and they
Yeah.
like even anger could be a way in which someone could come to know Jesus because they
Yeah.
see someone get angry about with the way someone's being treated.
Totally.
And
I mean, that's
that's
why,
yeah.
like, it's so fascinating how when these moral failures and things happen, it seems like the church oftentimes gets super defensive. I mean, I'm
Hmm.
just watching this happen play out right now, where it's like,
Yeah.
you don't know the whole story,
Yeah.
and it's like, okay, that's true. There's investigations take time. Whatever church, I mean, like, it took forever for the Hillsong stuff to finally come out, or
Hmm.
Southern Baptist Convention, but there was a lot of there's a lot of people who had been hurt, and it's like, I don't know if always being super defensive like that, being our posture, is always that helpful for the world. It's like, I think that there is such thing as justice and righteousness
Hmm.
matter, and so there is zeal for the Lord's house, so to speak.
Totally.
Overturning some tables is not always a bad
Is
thing.
not a bad thing. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, that's the whole thing. It's like the scriptures, saying, be angry but don't sin,
Hmm.
right? So
Hmm.
most of the time, it seems like we aren't very good at that. That's angry.
Yeah.
Anger can lead to a lot of unhealthy things, but there are times where I think anger is okay. You know.
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah, and the other thing I was thinking about was, ultimately, like you said in the beginning, ultimately, like sharing, like evangelism is sharing the good news of the
Mm,
gospel, and so I think it's also an invitation to us to, personally in our own lives, finding out if we believe that
yeah.
in a way, like
Mm,
what's the good news in our own lives that we want to share about Jesus, and
that's good.
maybe that's been lost or whatever. The good news is not for some people, it's for everyone.
Yeah.
So if I'm going, oh, I'm not sure how to share the good news, well, it's like, well, what is the good news that I want to share then? It's like
Mm,
that,
interesting.
does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I was just thinking about how I feel like like 25 years ago, I had more experiences where it was like, let me in this moment lead you to Jesus and pray with
Hmm.
you.
Hmm.
Whereas now I feel like most of the evangelistic things that happen again are in the context of discipleship. Like,
Hmm.
like, good point I think to make is that you can be a non-Christian and be being discipled,
Hmm.
right? So it's in the process of discipleship. It happens relationally over time where, people are slowly and ever so subtly beginning to see Jesus for who he is.
Hmm.
And I definitely think there is a moment where people make a conscious decision, by a work of the Spirit. See, I'm a Calvinist. By a work from the Holy Spirit, where they do make a conscious, willful decision to throw all the Arminians
Yeah.
a bone. Uh, they do that, and then there is a transitioning from, like Colossians, Paul talks about being transferred from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that happens, but it is interesting how sometimes it might you might not know the moment to even, where it's like this subtle relational thing, where you begin to experience. I love Jesus's words of abundant life, right? Like life
Yeah.
in the spirit in the kingdom is one that he wants us to experience abundant life. And so, yeah, this invitation to abundant life is something that we need to be pursuing for ourselves, and then also pursuing for other people,
Mm.
and advocating for. So
Yeah, that's good. I hmm, yeah, I'm pondering thoughts now. I
finally,
think I'm thinking about my thinking.
finally, yeah.
I'm going meta. No,
Let's
I
go deeper.
let's go deeper. No, but talking about the mess that the church is in now, the word evangelical is also in there, and there's so much mess. But I have seen, through it, a lot of people going, non-Christians going, this doesn't add up to the person that Jesus is. So even non-Christians are going, wait, Jesus isn't like this. So, there's an opportunity for the church to sort of reignite its mission to point people to Jesus in a
Mm,
way. And I remember, I think the best sermon I heard on this was uh, by Adam Russell, the lead worship person of the Vineyard, and he spoke about how that there's a very crucial differentiating factor in how we understand the kingdom of God in the church. And the church isn't the truth. The church always is pointing to the church, the truth,
mhm,
who is Jesus. And um, I think this is like a moment where we can go collectively, like, actually, we're focused on pointing to Jesus, and the church being stripped away. So, like, all the cover-ups, or all the things that are happening in the church, if a church is going through that, it's an amazing opportunity for the church to be completely honest, open,
mm,
focusing on the victims and stuff. If a church did that, I'm pretty sure people would be able to go, that makes sense. That seems in line with Jesus. Like,
mm,
being completely transparent, going, yes, this is wrong, and these are the steps we're making to correct it.
mm.
Um, that would be a way in which the church could point to Jesus even in a mess, and
Yeah,
evangelize even in a mess in that way. So I don't know.
yeah, yeah. Isn't it interesting? I find myself, I mean, and not just within, within like every tradition. Like I'm almost to the point where I think that you can't be a Christian and be a megachurch person, leader. Like it's like
It's
how many
tough.
more? Yeah, it's like gosh, the amount of not. I'm not even just saying moral failures. I'm talking about like just the way that people lead in corporate America being modeled, um, in the same vein, I guess. In the church, it's like, oh my gosh. Um, but yeah, it's like there's something unique about um, people who are humbly following Jesus and
Hmm.
acknowledging weaknesses and truths, and not pretending. Because I've just been thinking about it, like I all this stuff that's happening with the SBC and Hillsong. Like I'm been
The Anglican Church,
Anglicans, yeah, the
yeah.
Vineyard. I mean, it's
And
like
then also you think, oh, it's just Protestants, and then you've got the Russian Church advocating for the Russian,
I know,
the head of the
and
Russian Church, and they're
yeah,
going
and
through
then
a crisis. And
yeah, and then you have the Roman Catholic tradition and all their, you know,
if there's
it's
one thing
it's
clear, no, it doesn't matter what denomination,
yeah,
like moving denominations is not going to
that
create,
yeah, that's
you know what I
exactly it.
mean?
It's like
Yeah.
it's like okay, so I mean, there's just something really beautiful about the simplicity of following Jesus and living out the Sermon on the Mount,
Hmm.
and like actually trying to, um, keep in step with the Spirit and exercise the fruit of the Spirit. And yeah, I don't know. It's just interesting because it just feels like oftentimes I'm just like, well, I'm looking at this thing over here that's the church and how it's doing everything, and then I'm like, every day reading my Bible, and I'm like, I don't know, man. It just seems like there's some like it's like a disconnect here, and I say and to be honest, I mean that's even myself. Like I've been really thinking for about 3 years now. I'm kind of joking about, because I know, I mean, like, one bad mega church is just one bad mega church, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure there's large churches. But at this point in time, I'm 43 years old. I'm like, I feel like I just hear story after larger churches, and you hear these train wreck sagas of skeletons in this. It's like, what did Mark Driscoll say? That behind Mars Hill was like a trail of bodies or something. Like he was driving that bus, and
Yeah.
it's like, man, I don't want to have that. But then I also can, every church I've ever been a part of, there's always stories of people who get offended or, whatever, and then are no longer a part of your community. And, they all have stories too. So it's like, man, it's just really tough to navigate relationships, and yet, like, when it comes down to, like, what's the effective way to do evangelism, it seems like relationship is such a central,
Crucial.
and yeah, it's like, that's how it happens, I guess. So anyway, I guess, so when I think about practical ways, though, going back to what we were talking about, practical ways for individuals to evangelize, you know what's like what are some books that you think would be helpful? So I do think people should read Power Evangelism by Wimber, just to have that as a grid, like, hey, you actually
Yeah.
might be able to pray for somebody, or the Holy Spirit might lead you to share a word. I would add some caveats, like, it's, don't assume you're in a Christian culture, so you might have to explain all of the things that you're saying. But
Yeah.
what are some things?
Well,
Or
it's not an
resources?
evangelism book, but I think one way is what you said, and I think this could be a cultural primary way in the cultural moment that we're in. Is I think in general, Christians are normally absolutely terrible at being friends with non-Christians. In my
Mm,
experience, like it just seems to,
yeah.
like, we just don't know. It's like, oh, we don't want to get too close, otherwise we might get, like, I don't know,
we might
whatever,
we might drink a beer
might be too
or something.
influenced by them or something, like,
Yeah.
something stupid like that. But
Well,
I
but hold on,
honestly,
pause for one
yeah,
second. Pause. I do want to. Do you agree or disagree, though? Because, like, I've seen that where, like,
mm,
there's two extremes where somebody becomes a Christian and then cuts off all their non-Christian friends, right? Because they're
yeah,
like, well, I don't
yeah,
want to be
yeah,
influenced by them anymore. And
yeah.
I'm always like, don't do that. You're making it seem like being a Christian's bad. But on the other hand, too, I do think, though, that when people become Christians, sometimes those relationships do change, and they almost have to, for the sake of their own, quote unquote, sanctification, or
Yeah, no,
whatever.
you're right.
So flesh that out. Like,
I probably went too far, but I
well,
think,
no, I mean, tell me, give me what you think on that, because I don't know. Like, I've
yeah,
seen it. I think more often than not, cutting off all your friends is bad.
yeah, yeah. Well,
But
I think,
someone who maybe is coming from an addictions
yeah,
background or situation, maybe they need to find new friends.
hmm,
I don't know.
yeah. No, you're absolutely right on that, and I think, uh, what I was thinking was, like, someone like Christine Pohl on
Mm-hmm.
hospitality is great because,
Mm,
that's what we're doing. Like, in a lot of ways, we're both inviting people into our lives as friends, and we're also allowing ourselves to be invited into their lives. And so it's like the
yeah.
practice of being hospitable and being hosted at the same
Mm,
time,
yeah. Being
and
able to receive.
being able to receive, and you know that's um that's really important, and maybe that framework is helpful to see through friendship,
Mm, yeah.
being
Well,
hostable
I
and
mean, yeah. I mean,
hosting.
like, the early church grows in the first 3 centuries of the church, and, like, numerous church historians have noted that it was hospitality,
Hmm.
radical
Radical
hospitality,
hospitality,
that
yeah.
that caused that. But yeah, I think you're right, though. It's interesting because, like, I have a lot of non-Christian friends just because of fishing, essentially, and
That's
it's like,
I mean, no, I was about to ask you. I mean, it's a big evangelism field for you in a way, because I know that there's
yeah.
people that have come to the church or come to know Jesus just through fishing with you, you know?
Yeah, it's weird. Because like I'm like, well, once you're in the church, we can't go fishing anymore. Just
That's
kidding.
funny.
Yeah, I'm like, we're done. But no, yeah, I don't know. But it's interesting because I think I've always, I don't know. I guess I haven't really thought about that. Like, I don't think I've ever in my life ever had only Christian friends.
Yeah,
But I
neither have I.
feel like, that's probably not common. I think most church people probably only have or
Yeah.
only Christian friends. Maybe, I don't know. But it's interesting being in the Bible Belt where I live, because good old Calabama has, there's like this everybody's a Christian thing. So it almost is inconceivable that there's people that don't know the truth, even though I think that if you look at the biblical definition for what it means to be a follower of Jesus, there's a lot of people who are checking a box but don't really know what it means to be a disciple. So, yeah. But friendship, yeah, it's
I mean,
it's hard to be friends with people though. Sometimes
it is. It can be quite tiring, but I don't know. Like two of my closest friends in South Africa are not Christians in any sense of the word, but they're super loyal. I could talk to them just about anything, and they know. Obviously, they know I'm a Christian and all of that. In fact, one of my friends listened to one of our podcasts and was like, "That was awesome." But
hello, South Africa. For you.
But I consider them very close, and I don't think there's anything, maybe apart from some spiritual stuff, that I wouldn't feel like I could talk to them about, which is weird to think about. In fact, there's a lot of stuff I would talk to them about that I wouldn't talk to them about with some Christian friends, because some of my Christian friends are. I don't trust them as much.
I was just thinking the same thing. And actually, as I was talking, I'm like, I'm not a very good friend I don't have a best friend.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Like I've never had really a best, I always been like, well, Don's my best friend. And she's like, you never talk to me. And I'm like, I know, that's how I like it. But okay. But I'm a 7. Okay. It's probably because I'm in.
You just want to have fun.
Yeah. I just want to have fun. So I've always had lots of friends, know, but I can't say I've ever had I think I've had people this is an interesting thing. Gosh, this is not about evangelism, but it kind of is. I'm connecting the dots right now, I think, because I think I'm a terrible pastor. I think I'm probably more an evangelist. I am wired to be thinking about outreach, outward, new people, following. That's what I'm passionate about. And so it's like, I have to remind myself, I'm like, oh yeah, Christians need care too. That's right. But no one's hiring evangelists. So I guess that's what happens in church. But I've always, my kids have said before, they're like, yeah, Mom and Dad, you guys go through phases where you hang out with certain people for a while, and then you start hanging out with new people. And I'm like, that's probably because I'm generally wired toward this desire to help people come to know Jesus, and then I guess the dysfunctional part, or the part that could probably hurt people, is it's like, and I've had that happen before. It's like, well, we don't ever hang out anymore. It's like, well, I'm busy, bro. I got these new people. Yeah, but I think being a friend. Have you ever read Becoming Friends by Paul Waddell?
No, but you've sent it to me, and I really need to.
So good.
I'm also thinking of Wesley Hill's book too.
Oh yeah, Spiritual Friends. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, both of those books, when I read both of them, I definitely was challenged. I want to be a better friend. But I don't know why I just don't have a best friend. I mean, I don't, because here's what's really, this is a therapy session, Wes.
No, I was like, this is great.
I'm like, yeah, you're loving this. I'm having this internal, what's wrong with me?
Processing.
But I don't even want to have a best friend. Is that bad?
No,
I'm not sacramental charismatic. I'm fundamentalist evangelical. What happened?
Just kidding. Well, it's not in the Bible. There's nothing about having a best friend in the Bible, so you're good. Okay. You're a Calvinist, remember? If it's not in the Bible.
We hate everybody.
Yeah.
we hate everybody. Jesus is my best friend. But I have definitely had a lot of close friends, but I just, the whole idea a best friend is like so weird to me because I just don't
Yeah.
like. What does that mean? Like, because I think I want my wife to be my best friend. Like that's the one Dawn is who I'd want to, be able to tell her everything. And see how I said be able to tell her
Right. Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. You want to, or
I
be
want
you.
to.
You want to be able to.
Yeah, I want to be a good husband.
That's awesome.
Anyway,
No,
yeah.
I
So,
think what we're talking about is this is a continuing conversation, but what it like friendships and the importance of friendships.
yeah,
Relating this to like church stuff, I've changed the language you use to talk about small groups in church as places where friends are made, because I think that is essentially what's happening. And
yeah,
I think that's honestly what's needed most in the world that we live in right now, especially post-pandemic, even
I like it.
pre-pandemic. The data coming out about how lonely people feel. I think that's a huge area of evangelism is just becoming friends with people. Basic, stuff that would probably be considered basic 20, 30 years ago about like making someone dinner or just like
Yeah.
noticing small things in their life is huge. So yeah, I think that could definitely be a way. So actually I'm thinking it would be cool to pivot and think about, we've been talking about individual ways, like what are some church way, like practical stuff churches can do as like a community to
Oh
evangelize.
man.
And I
Can we
tell
talk about
people
what they
this,
shouldn't do?
with all that too. But I tell people this all the time. Like the biggest cultural shock was moving to Red Bluff, and you're like, first thing you said to me was like, you can invite people to church. And I just finished seminary, and I just finished like 3 missional courses where like we were told not to do, like that doesn't work anymore in the post
Yeah.
secular world. Like you can't
Yeah.
invite, that the old ways. And I moved there, and you're like, yeah, just invite people to church. And I did. I
Yeah.
worked as
Like,
a bartender. And I think like 5 families came to the church because I was like, yeah, I'm a pastor at the church. You should come to church. And they're
there's
like,
still families
okay.
who still come to church here because
And,
you like served them a
yeah,
beer and invited them to church.
it's
Yeah.
crazy.
I know that was what it was funny when I moved here, kind of the same thing, like I had done a lot of theological and leadership training on postmodernity and missional engagement with the secular world. And I was like, when I was like, like people don't hate the church here.
Yeah.
They're like actually open. Like,
Yeah.
what? Yeah, that's funny.
But it did made me think is
But,
like, I don't think it matters where you're at. Like no matter like, yeah. Okay. So where I live, there's definitely more of a stigma towards the church. However, I still don't think that's dead, inviting people to church. And so that begs the question, like, is your church set up to welcome non-church people? And not in a mega church way, but just in a basic hospitality way. Like, are you set up? Is the language you're using, when they walk into the side, like into your church building, are they going to feel like excluded? All of that stuff.
Yeah, but I think even back up before that though. This goes back to the friendship with non-church people. I don't know. I mean, I've been to a lot of churches in my life, and most of the time I'm just like, oh, like that was not very intentional about non-church people. And so I want to just maybe highlight what you had said earlier about friendship. And part of the reason why I think having friends that are not Christians is really helpful to remind yourself that not everybody like gets it and has insider language. I mean, like, I just don't, it's like almost like most churches, and this is super judgy of me, but I honestly think that based on just watching people's online services or going to churches, I don't know if most people have any awareness at all about how their church service comes across, and the only reason, I mean, you probably already know this story. I feel like I've shared it with you before, but when I was pastoring so when I became a senior pastor at the wise age of 24, 6. And which I'm like, oh my gosh, that's the worst thing. I feel bad for those people.
By the way,
But
did you see that stat? Sorry, do you see that stat that only 15% of pastors are under 40 in
that
America?
makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway, sorry, carry
young pastors aren't very smart, so it's only older
on.
40-plus-year-old pastors that are smart.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm pastoring this small church, and we were a small charismatic church in the middle of nowhere, and I had, I think I was finishing my MDiv at the time. But I was reading a lot of post-modernity and missional. It was like during the emerging church time too, and everybody's trying to rethink how to reach the next generation and whatever. But at some point in time, I just remember I was getting gas at a gas station, and I walked in, and I used to talk to this lady all the time. And she had zero church connection. I mean, like, she had never been to church. She just did not. She's pretty unchurched life. Pretty, like, churchy people would say, oh, she had a real rough background, but she's just not church,
Yeah.
And but I talked to her all the time, and so I finally was like, hey, would you come to my church? If I paid you $50, would you come to my church and, like, just give me some feedback about how weird it is, or if it's good or what? And, we had enough of a relationship. She was like, oh yeah, totally. I'd be willing to do that. So she came to it was so bad. I didn't even know how bad it was, though. Like,
Yeah. You have no idea.
I knew it was bad, but I didn't know it was that bad.
Yeah.
And so she, stayed, and she sent me this email. It was like, it wasn't 10 pages long, but it was long. It was like a detailed, from her perspective, and it was like everything we did was weird, and we didn't explain any of it. She didn't understand, like, the Christian karaoke thing. Why were we staring at this screen with some words on it?
That's
it's just like,
so good.
dude, it was like, yeah, and but what was cool is that email I sent to our board, and I was like, hey, this is just some feedback for us to think about. And half of the board, I feel like, were super, like, bitter and angry, or like, it was personal. Well, they're not Christians, they wouldn't get it. But half of them were like, okay, this is helpful. And I think that churches would be really wise if you don't have non-church people coming in regularly. There's a reason why. And one way to maybe address some of those things would be so a practical way for churches to evangelize is become a church that people would like to actually visit. This is not at all replacing the outreaches or the ministries or the those type of things, because I get it. Like, in New York City, it might be harder to invite somebody to visit your church. I get that, but
yeah.
I still think that there's probably a majority of American churches where you could still invite people to church. And even in Houston, dude, you're like, it's still Texas.
Yeah.
Everybody's Baptist, so whatever. But yeah, so I things like that, becoming more aware, because when you just hear things, what I realized, and that was the beginning of me being consciously aware of the fact that everything that we did on Sunday mornings had to be framed in some way, shape, or form. So, like, the Eucharist is the one that because of, I'm so judgmental about the Eucharist. I know it's terrible, but I went to a church recently. I visited this church, in Southern California, and pretty fast growing church. It was just planted a few years ago, but their communion time was like, theologically, I was like, no, because it was just like, hey, we're going to sing this next song. This last song was after the sermon. They sang it, and people were just randomly walking all over the room to the back table getting something. But it was like probably 20% of the church doing it, and everybody else, it seems like they were mostly, it was a lot of new people there, and it was like people you could see were looking around, like, wondering what was going on, but there was no explanation whatsoever, which is typical church world, right? Like, we do these Christian practices, and we don't give any context for it at all. And so, like, it was super awkward. So I didn't receive communion that day. I didn't even know we were able to. And I was like, this is blasphemy. It's terrible. So the songs, the way that I mean, just everything. I guess that would be my thing for pastors would be like, A, get some non-church people in your church, have them give you some feedback. And then B, I just think it's like the at least the lead pastor, if not everybody on the ministry team, should be thinking about that question. Like, how is this going to, and I get it. It's challenging, man. It's like you're trying to, on any given Sunday, I'm keenly aware of the fact that I have people who have been following Jesus for longer than I'm alive. And then I also have lots of people who have never been in church before. Like, I just know that, so is it easy? No, it sucks.
Yeah.
I wish it'd be easy, but man, that's how you do it,
Yeah. And I mean, I think what you said is like constantly communicating and explaining, like just that, like I can totally picture that being something you say from stage, like, hey, we have a diverse group of people. Some people, this is their first time in the church. Some people have been coming here for 30 years. That's the reality we're living in. And that's sort of like, in chaplaincy, one of the biggest things I learned, like one of the most powerful things you can do in a pastoral capacity is naming what's happening in the room. And just like naming it can be a very powerful tool, because you're just setting the tone and you're telling people you're setting the context, right? You're saying this is where we're at.
And totally. I mean, I think it's part of pastoring the church. I mean, it's I guess I just feel like a lot of pastors don't think of it that way though. Like, cause they think of it as like, well, it's awkward under the hood stuff. Or it's like, oh, it's not really for everybody. It's like, no, that's the whole point. I think you have to shepherd your church community to be outreach minded. I mean, that's that right there. We should, gosh, there's so many things. This is I have a billion opinions on this.
We should do a part 2.
Yeah. Like, but it's like, okay, here's another thing. The lead lag goals, right? So if you, so anybody listening, look up lead and lag goals. Like if you have a goal of reaching more people, then there's certain things that you have to do that lead you to it, right? So that the primary goal lags behind it. But, if your goal is to become more of an outreach missional church, then you have to do some things to get the community to be in that frame of mind, and it's like, you have to model it. You have to actually, like, I'll tell you one thing that was really hard for me to do was when I started, like, this is before we were here, but our previous church, when we started having visitors come regularly, they don't know my name. They don't know anything about me. So every Sunday morning saying, hi, my name is Luke. I'm one of the pastors here. Like, all the new people were like, oh, thank you. Like, it's good. Nice. Like they don't know me, but it was really hard to do that every Sunday because it's like, well, everybody knows me. So little things like that. What would that be though? That's hospitality. That's being a hospitable host, right? So I just think that there's so many things that pastors would need to do, and I want, if they're trying to think about practical things. I mean, number one, get some feedback from. So I'll try to do a five step to be a practical step to be a church to evangelize. It's like, okay, so number one, hire some non-church people to come to your church and give you some feedback. And don't get mad. Like, the feedback is actually, it's hilarious. Some of it was like so funny.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say, and also, like, when you get speakers into the church, like, even though they're Christian, they've been to other churches probably, and they could probably like, oh yeah, you're doing this, or do whatever.
Here's the 20 things you're doing wrong. Steve Nicholson. Steve's so great because he has so many good observations. But so number one, get some non-church people in, because I was just thinking about one thing. The lady even said, she's like, for a church that was saying that you guys, or she said, like, for being a church that describes itself as being friendly, no one talked to me. Dang. And I was like, I know, dude, it was like just stingers, man. It was stingers. I was getting punched in the face in this 10-page email. But so number one, get some non-church people to come. Number two, I think you need to identify, if the goal is to become more of an outreach church, you need to identify some of the things that you're going to need to do to get the church community to be on board with that. Something like sermon series that like root root the church's mission in the mission of God. Like our mission is God's mission, not we don't. Every church has this stupid little slogan saying, but it should be the church's
knowing
mission,
God.
right?
No,
Yeah,
knowing
yeah. I mean,
Jesus.
ours is the mission
Yeah,
of
yeah.
God. That's exactly
Yeah,
that's why we don't have a loving God and loving people and making disciples well for the glory of God. You know, sorry, I just got things to say. Okay, but yeah, like so figuring out, building in a biblical theological framework for the church to operate on, praying regularly for people to come to faith publicly. And then I think another thing would be to reward, like if people are bringing their friends to church, you should reward that. Like what gets rewarded gets repeated. So celebrating people when
sharing
they
testimonies.
Do that. Yeah. Just things like that. There's a lot of different ways to do it.
Yeah.
So that's number 2. Number 3. What's number 3? What are you going to throw in there?
What was so rooting it in biblical theology, hiring someone to come in and to tell you what you're doing wrong. I think
tell us what we're doing wrong.
Well, I think one thing that I think a church of any size can do is probably Alpha. You could do Alpha, but I will say this. I will say don't do Alpha and then like not change. Like if non-church people are not coming through your doors, and then you're like, okay, well, let's do Alpha. I think that's great, but then there needs to be a corresponding change to the Sunday service and church life in general to welcome those people in. So there needs to be a dual. Like I think one of the best churches I've seen lead this recently is Columbus Vineyard. They have incorporated their whole church in the Alpha journey. So which is a big thing for a church of that size to do. So they've said we're prioritizing Alpha as the main thing. The whole church is like saying this is what we're going after. So they incorporate it in the sermon, and at the end of the sermon they say this is what we're doing. This is how you can all be involved. So they involved the whole church, even though not obviously everyone in the church was going to be involved in Alpha. In the running it, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I think something like that would be really helpful. So that
it's a church, like a church-wide
thing. Like, hey, we're all doing this together. That way, when people do come from Alpha, everyone's aware. Everyone knows what the target has been. They update on that target and they go, "This is where we're at. This is how it went." If that makes sense, and that creates a lot of trust, consistency, all of that good stuff. So yeah,
I like it. Gosh, I mean, there's just so many. We're just spitballing right now. We should.
Well, you're the one that said we need. Huh?
Why didn't you prepare? Jeez.
Well, then I also think regularly communicating to your church, like, hey, invite people to church.
Yeah, no kidding.
Like, I mean, it's so simple, but like, hey, we're set up events that people can invite their friends to church to.
Yeah.
Like, if that is a thing where it's just like, no, set up an event where you can say, hey, this event is primarily for you to invite your friends to.
Yeah, like what we've tried to do here is we have 2 types of events. We have like events that I would say are attractional or outreach, minded, therefore non-church people. And then we have what I call like discipleship, events that are more geared towards, connecting community, building community, or I guess maybe discipleship's not the right word, but we have ones that are for like the church community to get to know each other better. And then we have other events, like bowling nights or I don't know, our adult prom that we've done before, where
are you guys still doing that?
No, but were you at our first one? We'll do one eventually, but you were at our first one, right? The 80s.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was a huge success.
Yeah.
I was so surprised. I was like, people want to come to this? Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, you were. And I was like, no, my age people are dorks. We all wish that we had gone to prom and had a better experience. So yeah, that's funny.
No, that makes sense.
Well, dude, I think we should do a part 2.
I think we should do a part 2 fleshing out like the communal aspect.
Yeah,
for sure.
I think we can prepare. How about we do a 5 steps to becoming a practical, or 5 practical steps for a church to become more evangelistic.
Boom. That's a great tagline. Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, hey, thank you for listening to this episode of the Sacramental Charismatic. We are grateful for that. If you do us a favor and like and share and leave a review, that would actually help us out quite a bit. So, Wes, you got anything else you want to end with?
No.
He's shaking his head no, so that means peace out.
Cool. Bye, everybody.